Hello. Sorry, gotta get that box off my screen. But thank you. I'm so excited to, as Marie indicated, talk about our part one of a two-part series, and we're gonna break down the process evaluation. And well, I thought it would click. There we go. A couple of things we're gonna accomplish today. We're gonna talk about process evaluations in general, what they are, why we want to do them, how we can use them, some of the necessary steps that we're going to take when we're thinking about starting and conducting our process evaluation, and talking a little bit about the importance and the use of third-party evaluators when we're looking at completing those process evaluations. So Marie already introduced me, but I'm Lauren. I am the founder of Allard Consulting, and my team and I work collaboratively with treatment providers, recovery court programs, law enforcement agencies, just a plethora of individuals across the state of Tennessee to support their grant objectives and goals, but also just to help with any evaluation questions that they have. So we'll breeze on through me. Process evaluations. We're going to set the stage. We're going to talk and move a little bit between just evaluation in general, and then kind of hone in and focus on that process evaluation. So the basic definition from the dictionary of evaluation is it's a determination of the value, nature, character, or quality of something or someone. And so what we want to really take from this definition is, we're gonna start breaking things down. We're gonna look at the pieces of the whole. And so we're gonna consider why we want to evaluate anything in the first place. Why do we want to break down the sum of the parts? And so typically, at least for me, there are questions burning inside of us that we want to answer. And we want to find that in a timely manner. We want to improve our program design and our implementation. How are the activities we're doing as a program working? And do we need to build on that or modify, pivot? We want to demonstrate the impact of our program to our stakeholders. And that the word stakeholder is going to be broad scope here. That could be, potential funders, that could be community, individuals in our communities. It could be, just our team in general. It could be the potential clients that we want to serve. Sometimes evaluation can be a requirement of funding sources. So I know there's several of you on today that have worked it with me as part of receiving a federal funding award. And so that's a way we can, work with an evaluator and collaborate and kind of dip our toe in the water sometimes. And last but not least, it is best practice to conduct evaluation. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit. So we have our 10 key components of drug courts and our National Association of Drug Court Professional Best Practice Standards. Both of those have placeholders for monitoring and evaluation. I believe it's the 8th key component and it's number 10 in our best practice and standards. But what essentially they're saying to us is that, it is best practice, among those recovery or drug courts, to do evaluation that separates them from just business as usual. And we want to, according to these best practices, want to monitor on a regular basis. They recommend at least annually. We want to monitor the participant outcomes, attendance, whether they're making their appointments, results of drug screens, completion rates of programs. We want to look at those kind of key things, and also bring in, that skilled and independent evaluator, not necessarily all the time, but we want to bring them in at some point to have that objective bird's eye view of our program and to bring us some recommendations that we can then utilize to improve our program and our processes. And then we're going to continually monitor the data and the things that we are generating as part of our program. So, it's important when we are sitting and asking ourselves why, to recognize that as stewards of recovery courts and being a part of these programs and best practices, that these are things that you're already implementing in your policies and procedures anyway, if you're adhering to the model. So we want to make sure we don't forget that monitoring and evaluation is something we already are supposed to be doing. So when we think about a process evaluation, we're looking at describing the specific activities, policies, procedures that we're implementing in the recovery court. And we want to determine whether or not those program activities, policies, procedures, all the things we're doing have been implemented as we had intended them to, but that they, resulted in certain outputs that we're not expecting to see. So what can come out of a process evaluation? Well, the results will ultimately strengthen your program's ability to report on what it is you're doing and improve those future activities. So if you're looking to expand a portion of your programming or identify some new evidence-based practices that you're interested in implementing, having this information can, set the foundation to support either answering those questions as to should we do this, or see where we are today. It's really going to answer those who, what, when, where questions. So who did we direct our program efforts to? What services did our participants receive? How much and what types of services did we provide? And did we encounter any barriers or facilitators to implementation of our activities? So when we think about, the right time to do anything, I think it's general rule of thumb, there's never a right time. But the best part about a process evaluation is that it can be conducted periodically throughout the lifetime of a program. We generally see them done during the development of a new program or, in the early stages of programs. But we know that, change happens and that's okay. So we might have new judicial leadership or a new program coordinator, or maybe we've identified some things in the program and the processes that we're interested in changing. So it's a great time to then say, hey, maybe we need to do another review, do another process review, because things happen. So why should a recovery court consider a process evaluation? Well, we want to have that periodic evaluative information. We want as much as possible, if it is possible, to have that third-party objective person come in and determine, hey, are we operating efficiently and effectively? Are we serving those that we intended to in the best possible manner? And we're always looking to continually improve. We need to collect data, and many of you are already collecting bukus of data, which I have the pleasure of looking at. I love it. And review that to determine our progress towards those goals and objectives we've laid out for ourselves. And we want to inform reporting, whether that is to our stakeholders in the community, to our internal program team. We want to make sure, hey, are we appropriately established? Are our operations functioning? And how well are they functioning? So a couple other reasons why we might choose to do a process evaluation is that there are aspects, and the whole program is important, but there might be areas that we need to look at that are important to the success. How, that might be the referral and admission of our participants. How do people come in? How do we actually serve someone, get to the point of serving someone? What is the participants' attendance or exposure to the treatment modalities and the services we're offering through our program? What is their adherence to the actual program? And are they satisfied? People tend to think that satisfaction is, an outcome, but it's really descriptive of what the process is and how satisfied someone is with, how they were treated along the way. So we also can gauge staff perceptions. It's a great opportunity to interview staff and understand how they're working within their daily operations, what it is they're being tasked to do. Are there barriers and challenges that they're facing that, may be impacting the program's ability to, have a swift or fluid process for referrals, intakes, admissions? Or are there places where there are challenges just in implementing case management tools or whatever that might be? So we have a lot of reasons why that we might choose to do a process eval. So we have some benefits, and these are just a few, but there are many benefits, including, we're able to identify ways to implement evidence-based practices that we are looking to have as part of our programming. We're hoping to improve participant results by looking at our processes and seeing if there are gaps, challenges, barriers. We're able to then inform resource allocation and potentially decrease costs. If we see that there's some places where in our processes where we're maybe spending a lot of time and energy or money, we might be able to look at that and say, is there an alternative we haven't considered? We can go back to our peers and say, is this an area where you found another way? We can also increase our accountability as a program, and we can provide clearer expectations among our staff. If we're using a process evaluation to understand our team's perspectives and perceptions of how things are going, we can also identify, are there ways or are there areas that they're not actually clear on what it is that needs to happen, and provide some better information moving forward. We can also enhance the perception and confidence among policymakers, stakeholders, the communities we're living in and working in, and potentially prospective clients. We want to make sure, and I'll kind of string this in throughout, that we're visualizing, we're putting out in our marketing materials, what it is our program is doing well, how we're serving individuals, because they're the ones who and their families see these materials. And we want to, engage them to come into these programs and to see the same benefit that you all see. So a process evaluation doesn't have to stand alone. Oftentimes, we'll see that they're actually being done in conjunction with an outcome evaluation, or it's a companion to other types of evaluation that you might choose to do later on. So it's not necessarily something that, is we've done it and there's nothing else that we can do, but it really acts as a springboard to some other really interesting analyses and types of evaluation. But ultimately, a process evaluation is going to describe the program as it's actually experienced. And that's how it's experienced by the clients, by the staff that's running the program, and the perceptions of those stakeholders who might be engaging. So we are going to do a quick chat post. In one word, if you could put in, and Marie's going to read them out for us, how are you feeling right now? We've just kind of touched the waters of process eval. Just give me one word.
Excited. Interested. Interested.
Love it.
Inspired. Interested.
Okay, we got a lot of interest. That's good.
Learning. Planning. That's all good.
I love it. I usually get excited as well, but I'm also hopeful because, when I come into programs, seeing how you operate, what it is you do on a daily basis, you and your teams know that better than anyone. And so I'm always really hopeful because, I have the opportunity to say, hey, we are, in this group of people is so committed and so engaged with the populations they're serving, and they want to do it better. Sometimes it's just hard to remember or prioritize some of these tools like process evaluation that can get us to that point. So I'm always excited and hopeful. So we're going to keep on trucking. So we're going to start looking at some evaluation steps. And there are 4 kind of core things we're going to walk through today. We're going to talk about asking important questions about either a sub-project that you're doing as a program or about the program's overall processes and outcomes. We want to understand how to gather evidence and understand what data, what's going to support us getting answers to the questions we have. We're going to interpret and analyze that data. And we want to do that collaboratively, especially within if we have the opportunity to have an evaluator. And we're going to talk through a little bit later, why it's important to collaborate on interpretation. And then we want to use and report those results. So we want, again, to be accountable. We want to be looking to improve. We want to plan for future endeavors. So we're going to take this one step further. And when we think about asking those important questions, our questions might be centered around goal achievement. Are we actually meeting the goals and objectives we've outlined in our policies and procedures? Have we implemented the program to fidelity? Have we implemented it in the way, and can we actually say our practice meets our policy? Is what we do reflected in our policy and vice versa? We can ask questions about the outcomes of the participants or of the program. And we can also look at sustainability as we're thinking about questions. How do we sustain beyond either this funding source or this, whatever that looks like? So we're also going to start gathering that evidence. And this is a great place to bring in that third party objective evaluator who can, help identify the research methods that the program's going to use to answer those questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those in a minute. We have the ability to, bring in institutional data and also have expert feedback. So I know Marie has brought in so many experts in the department to talk to us about different aspects of recovery court programming, but we also have the ability to seek out, I know my team will go and just start cold calling programs that have done something similar to see where their barriers, challenges lied. How did they do it in order to, help inform us on what we're trying to ask questions on. So you can always go back to an expert in the field. As we interpret our data, we're starting to think about and look at the strengths and weaknesses that are coming out in front of us. What are the things about the questions we answered or asked that are happening that are doing really well? And did we find some deficits or some weaknesses that we need to pivot and improve on? And then as we use and report on results, we're looking again for that continuous improvement. We're planning for those future endeavors or future funding sources. We're holding ourselves accountable, and we're taking our evidence of capability. So this is where, again, how we might utilize visuals to show we are operating our program and we're able to say, hey, we're showing you, we're demonstrating that we're capable, our capacity to serve these individuals, how we're able to do that, how well we're able to do that. And we're building on the existing knowledge base. So, doing a process evaluation affords you an opportunity to contribute to the overall, recovery court conversation in Tennessee and also nationally. You're able to help your peers and peer courts and say, hey, this is what's working, this didn't work, or we have similar populations and we saw these challenges. You're able to, take that. And I know there's a lot of exchange on policies and procedures, for example, in the state as new courts come up, or sharing of forms. It gives us another thing that we can send out to our peers as well. So as we walk through these important questions, there's some steps we want to follow. We're going to gather our team to help us develop those evaluation questions. And we might engage some or all of the stakeholders. It might just be our core team, but there might be some outside individuals that we need to bring in as well, who are kind of involved in our strategic planning to help us develop these evaluation questions we have. Or we might identify people we want to share our evaluation questions with at some point. We're going to review the supporting materials that we already have. So we're going to take the time to look through our existing policies, our forms, anything that is structural to the program itself. So we can identify, hey, what are the areas we actually want to build important questions around? We're going to brainstorm those evaluation questions. And we can do that specifically, about a program activity itself, or we can keep it pretty broad and say, we want to, have questions about the overall program that we're trying to answer. We want to focus on, our goals and our strategies and objectives. And so we're going to brainstorm in all of these different facets. We're going to then take that information and that brainstorm, that dump of questions that we now have, and we're going to start sorting them into categories and groups. We want to be able to see everything because, there might be things that are important to some stakeholders. Time is also a factor. Do we have enough time to answer all of the questions that we have? So we're going to start sorting and grouping so we can see what we actually have in front of us. And then we're going to decide on which questions we're actually going to answer. So As we're gathering the evidence, I've already mentioned that an evaluator can, help us define the methods that we're using to answer those questions. And they're also able to help support where is the data going to come from? Is it accessible? Is it something that we need to now create more data to answer the questions that were identified in the brainstorming process? So we have some different types of data. We have our quantitative data, which is our counted, measured, expressed as a number. It's usually asking how much or how many. And we have our qualitative information that is more descriptive, conceptual, and it's non-statistical. So our evaluator can come in and help us determine what types of data we might need to be collecting, and then the types of instruments that we need to collect that information with. And we have several things available to us. We can do interviews with participants, with team members. We have the ability to conduct focus groups, get a small group together and, ask questions about specific parts of the program. We can use existing data reports and our internal program documents that we've already been reviewing. We can develop a survey. I know several of you have implemented some kind of satisfaction survey, but we can also do other surveys throughout our programming. Do we want to only collect information about a participant's experience at the end of the program? Have we really considered everything that happens from start to finish if we do that? So we have some options there. And then we also have our national and professional reference materials that we can go back to, or that an evaluator can help you discern through, because there's a lot of information. As we interpret the data, personally, my favorite part is the analysis, determining which statistical techniques we're going to use, how we're going to clean and analyze this information that we've now gotten together to answer these questions. And then we get to have a discussion. And that interpretation, as I said, is a collaboration between the team and the evaluator. We want to be able to understand, as the third party person, here's what I'm seeing, but you might have historical context that isn't written down. Maybe there was a leadership change. Maybe there were some other factors that aren't necessarily written as policy that contributed to some of the challenges or changes you're seeing in your data. And so before we report out to someone else about whether that's a good or a bad thing, we need to have that conversation to have that context. When we're using our results, it's really important, and I think I talk about this all the time, is who is our audience? Who is the intended recipient of the information that we've now spent all of this time and effort collecting, managing, analyzing? Who are we sharing it with? And we need to consider different ways to communicate. We all have different learning styles, but how do we communicate those results? Do we need a full report, something that's, anywhere from maybe 10 to 25 pages? Do we just need one page to summarize everything we have kind of found with, one or two graphics and maybe some icons to help support the information that we're sharing? Do we need a PowerPoint? Or, in some cases, we might need all three, because we know we might be disseminating information to various stakeholders at any given time. And so we want to be prepared for whatever the situation is to be able to report that information back out and have that information be digested by the recipient in a way that makes sense. We want to build a timeline to execute results and recommendations. So essentially, we don't want all of this work to be a report on a shelf. That's never the intention with my team. We want you to have something you can work with and have as tangible to say, okay, we can do this in the short term. This might take some extra effort. Here's some long-term goals. And keep that momentum going, because we want to ultimately have this process start over. We want evaluation to be continual. We need to have the ball moving and building on those recommendations so we can find the next thing that we're going to be looking at and working on. So I've got an example, and we're going to walk through this. So we have Jane, and she's a coordinator, and she has questions. So she has basically decided that the scope of her activity for today's purpose is just looking at her referral processes. So she's got questions about why her program's referrals have taken a sudden decrease. She wants to know, and her team want to know why referrals from specific referral sources have been decreasing. Why are specific populations denied more than others to her program? And why is the time frame between someone's referred to the program and them being accepted and or denied increasing? So she's kind of started to build a framework of questions that she wants answered about one specific portion of her process. So as she's looking to gather evidence and she's bringing in an evaluator, she's, identifying, hey, we have got existing resources. We have our past referral and denial records. Some programs keep denial sheets that have indicators. I know that they'll mark off this is the reason someone was denied and keep that information available so that they can go back and say, hey, we know why people were not coming into the program. Jane's going to look at her population demographics. So as part of that referral sheet, she's got information about the potential client, but then we also have information, in this case, we're going to say in 10 wits, on who is actually accepted into the program. So how does the population demographics, whether that's race, gender, age, differ between those that were denied and those that were accepted? We're also going to access our existing resources from entities such as NADCP, the NDCI, Center for Court Innovation, because they have existing research and information that we can look at specifically about this particular portion of our process. Her evaluator is going to come in and help her determine what data collection information she needs. So she's got some denial records, but maybe some additional surveys or interviews of referral sources are necessary for us to have a whole picture of what it is that her program's actually, what barriers the program faces or the successes it's having related to referrals. The evaluator is going to help implement those tools and then also conduct some secondary research as needed. So we've gotten and collected all of this information, and the evaluators interpreted the data and kind of come back to Jane and said, there is a steady decrease of female referrals over the past 3 years. We can see, within our data set that this is happening. We did interviews and understand that probation indicated that they're referring fewer program candidates, but they attribute that because they're providing more case management services in-house before they violate a client or an individual. We are seeing that there's some referrals that were originally coming to recovery court that are now being referred to a new treatment court established in the area. So in this case, 20% of the former, what's the right word, appropriate candidates are now going to the DUI court because they're also appropriate for that. And our referral process, as it was observed, and our evaluator was able to come in and look at our policies on how we refer, intake, and admit someone, actually didn't match what we were doing in practice. And so, some of the strengths that, we might find is that we historically, for looking at several years of data, Jane's program had a historically robust and diverse set of referrals. Only in the last 3 years, we've seen this downturn in females. And they improved their processes and built in some additional assessments to help better pre-screen their clients before coming into the program. So she's got some data that she's talking with her evaluator, and they're going through this, and they want to ultimately use and report on those results. So, some recommendations that might come out of this is, looking at developing a partnership with the local women's jail case managers or criminal justice liaisons within the next 30 days. Is there something that, we're missing as far as a partnership or a referral source that is directly linked to that population that we're seeing a decrease in. And what can we do about that? We might want to quarterly reintroduce the recovery court to all of our referral sources and community partners so that they understand that despite there being a new treatment court in our area, that we are still here, still serving individuals. And we know that there's turnover in the public defender's office, the district attorney's office, within our community partners. So we want to make sure that the people who are going to refer to Jane's program have the information to actually say, oh, this person is a good candidate. I need to send them over to and refer them to recovery court. Another recommendation that might come out of this is to update that policy and procedure manual to reflect the actual process changes that weren't the practices that were happening that weren't reflected in policy within the next 30 days. So we're putting a timeline on it. We're not saying, here's your report and go forth and conquer. We're saying, here's some actual achievable timelines on how we can implement and utilize the results that we've received. When we're considering the report, the evaluator might come in and again, make one or all of the recommendations. They may do a presentation to the team to describe the information that they've analyzed. There might be a one-pager. So if we're taking something to a referral source to describe our program and its benefits, that might just be limited to a one-pager. Or we want to talk to our referral sources about some of the challenges we're seeing. So we want to condense that information down into something a little bit more digestible and then discuss that with those teams and stakeholders. So I'm going to pause and do a question break, and you can unmute yourselves. But if you have any burning questions at this point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Hearing none.
Well, Lauren, this is Debbie, and I hate to start this because I am so new to this, but my question, when you refer to a third-party evaluator, the way ours is set up, I'm serving as a volunteer evaluator. Is that an acceptable way to start out, or should we consider having I'm not a member of the court. I've been observing it. Is that going to work in Tennessee?
Yeah, so we're actually going to get into a whole section in part 3 about evaluators. So I don't want to prematurely answer the question, but I think that, what I can say is, yes, that is definitely going to work. Your experience and ability to, look at the program as it's being implemented is still third party. You're not participating or executing every piece of the implementation. You're there to observe and to say, hey, this is what you said you were going to do. This is how you're actually doing it, and providing that consultation back and forth with them. So part 3, I think, is where your question will be answered, but definitely it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry, whoops. Okay, so some of the necessary steps also. When we're looking at process evaluations, they typically include, I'm calling it 8 steps, but depending on what resource you're looking at, it could be 6, it could be 10. It really is going to be how you and your evaluator ultimately collaborate in what kind of process they have. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define who's responsible for actually conducting the process review and who that person will report to. So sometimes it's not feasible to have an evaluator. So if we're doing that self-assessment internally, who's actually going to be doing that? Is it the data champion? Is it the coordinator? Are they one and the same? And who does that information need to go back to? We're going to also identify the scope of what we're reviewing. So in our example with Jane, she was looking at one specific piece of her program. But if she were conducting a overall program process evaluation, she's going to develop some key questions, those key evaluation questions about every portion of that process. We're going to determine the methodologies that we're going to use to identify, collect, and analyze relevant information. If we're just, looking at self-assessing, we might only have the ability to look at the reports in Tinwitz, for example, or we may only have our actual physical records of clients if we have some additional information like referrals and denials. That's not something that typically goes into Tinwitz. It's usually when they're admitted. So we might have to look at some other pieces of data that we have or spreadsheets to make a complete picture, or as complete as we can. But bringing in that, again, that evaluator can help, identify some different methodologies that we have already talked about, and then help analyze that information. Because, you have to consider your own internal skills as well. Are you capable of doing X, Y, and Z? And not putting that pressure on yourself if you don't need to. We want to develop the evaluation logistics, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but we want to have a start and stop date. How long are we looking to do this? If we're doing it internally, do we, have 3 months to spend? If we're part of a federal funding award, do we need to be doing this over the process of 3 years? What does that look like? We want to identify when our updates due. Sometimes that's predetermined if you do have a federal award, for example, quarterly, biannually, annually. But if we're doing it internal to our own program and that self-assessment, we need to identify what are those set dates that we're going to have something available for the team to consider. We want to identify what our deliverables are. What is it that we're actually walking away with? Is it that report? Is it that one pager? Is it just an overview of the data that we have evaluated? And what's kind of our post-review wrap-up follow-up? Number 5, we're going to conduct the actual evaluation. So we're collecting that data, qualitative and quantitative, and just synthesizing the program processes and any additional information. We're going to analyze that information. So we're going to use those accepted statistical and evaluative techniques. We're going to document our findings and implement those recommendations. And then we're going to reevaluate our program processes to make sure that we've actually achieved what it is we set out to do, and that, we're answering those questions of are we achieving our goals, and are we serving those participants to the best of our ability or in the best possible way. And again, that is, cyclical. It's not something that ends in, it's something we can pick up at any point in time. And a lot of you already have built into your policies and procedures as part of that monitoring and evaluation piece that you're doing this regularly. So what are you doing regularly? If we're chunking it out, if we're working with an evaluator, what are we actually looking at? So we want to reevaluate. So I want to talk a little bit about planning because it's so crucial to an actual evaluation, whether that's a process or an outcome evaluation. We want to have that timeline. So we're, again, looking at what is the time frame for completing this process evaluation. What questions are we going to have answered by the end? Because we may have more questions than time feasibly permits us to answer, or if we're working with an evaluator that they can answer within the time frame. So we want to make sure that we have not only clear and concise questions, but that we haven't overburdened the expectation of the timeline. And are there any deliverables that we need to identify, and when are they due on the timeline? And again, if we have federal reporting awards, we know that those are kind of already preset, but if we're doing this internally and self-assessing, we want to hold our own selves accountable and actually make a deadline. When am I going to look at this? When is this deliverable due? So I put a sample timeline, and I'm just going to assume in this case, Jane has 1 year to work through her process evaluation. Realistically, for just that one piece, she may not spend that much time, but we're going to say she gave herself a year. And in this planning phase, she's going to establish her contractor agreement with her, between herself and her evaluator if she's able to get one. She's going to start developing with the evaluator, we're assuming she has one. So she's developing that evaluation plan and there is a back and forth, a conversation about what is in that plan based on all of the information question gathering that we've already done. And we're going to identify that baseline or available data. So you can kind of see that there's a lot happening. A good chunk of the year is just set up in is in the planning and the setup of the actual evaluation compared to some of the other portions. We're going to, take time to look at the actual data collection. Do we need to do those interviews? We want to make sure that people have ample time to respond to interview requests, that we're scheduling them, for times that can meet their schedules. So that might take a little bit more time if we're looking to implement some of those other methods to actually collect the data we need to then do the analysis. So we might spend a little bit less time on that analysis piece. Not that it's not as equally important, but based on this timeline, here's our analysis of our information, and then we've got our reporting and use. So we really want to aim to deliver that report on the early side of reporting and use so that those recommendations can be realized with the team and interpreted with the team so that they can then start making those before the end of possibly the contract with that evaluator, so that we can, in a report, for example, put in any follow-up that actually occurred. So with Jane's recommendation to meet quarterly with referral sources, if that started happening before the end of the project or the time frame, we want to be able to put that in as something that was initiated as part of adhering to that recommendation. So we want to make sure, like I said, that we deliver that report in a time frame that the team can actually use and then report back and say, this is what we've done, this is what we've implemented. So some other planning and designing process evaluation components that I want to touch on are, we want to carefully consider what activities, what of the program's activities are going to be the greatest utility in answering key questions. So activities are the things that, that are part of what you're doing as a program. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about activities. If you're not familiar with a logic model, I am not going through one in its entirety today. It is a whole other conversation, but they are so incredibly useful. But this is some of the language that you would hear if you're using a logic model. And if there's any interest, we can set up another data series to talk about logic models. But we want to understand our program activities. And that is, sorry, forgive me, I've got my notes here. We've got a lot of different things. So we have our types of activities or the services that we're providing to clients that we might be looking at in our process evaluation. What types of treatment are we offering? Is it MAT? Is it IOP? What are we actually offering? Are we offering face-to-face case management? Are we now that we've had the pandemic, are we offering more virtual or teleconference, telehealth services? We're going to look at, in this process evaluation, the characteristics of our program participants. So what are the descriptive statistics about the people we're serving? Their age, gender, race, marital status, education status, living arrangement. All of these things that we're collecting in 10WIDs are part of that descriptive review of the client. And we want to make sure that we're assessing whether we're reaching that intended target population. So we know we have our risk needs assessment. We know our recovery courts are looking to accept those high risk, high needs clients. And so are we doing that? And we can use the data we have to determine that. We're going to also, in a process evaluation, consider the characteristics of our staff. What is their demographics? What is their education or their years of work experience? And that's going to play a role as well. We can talk about the frequency of service delivery. How often are services being rendered? If a provider you collaborate with only offers MRT once, and please forgive me, I'm making this up, but, once every 6 months, then, how does that impact someone's ability to either move through the phases of programming or, receive that treatment within your program timeframe? We also have the duration of service, so how long a particular service lasts. We have our scope of services, so we're looking at, how many providers do we have access to provide the services that our court has. So whether that's employment agencies or partnerships, education partners for GED or HiSET, if that is treatment providers in our community, how many of those are there, and where are those services located in relation to our participants? Can they actually get there, even though the service is offered and available? We have our service dosage, so how many participants, complete a given service or activity in the duration of the program. We have our fidelity to our service models. So this looks at how closely the services correspond to the original model, and if there's any changes that occur. So we also have, last but not least, our client satisfaction. So that's our participants' perceptions of responsiveness to their individual needs while they're in the program. So these are all things that are activities that are done within a recovery court that we would look at during that process evaluation. And so having an understanding of your own activities, not everything may fit in these categories, or you may have other things you're doing, better examples than mine, but you want to understand what are the actual inputs and resources we have, and what are the activities that we're doing, because that's going to contribute to our outputs. And how that works is we're basically going to say, okay, we've identified our questions, we've started planning for our process eval, we have decided on the areas of the program activity that are of the greatest interest to us. So maybe it's something, several of these items on this list, and now we need to operationalize those as process indicators or outputs. So we want to have our quantitative indicators of measure. So how can we measure our ability to, how can we measure our activity based on these categories? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just so you can get a flavor for, just a couple of examples. So when we're looking at types of program activity, we might look at the distribution of the services provided. So what kinds of actual services do we have available? Types of therapies or classes that are available to individuals in our program. When we think about the characteristics of our participants, we might operationalize that by looking at the number and proportion of participants who use methamphetamine at program admission. It's something that we can now tangibly look at and hold as far as the number goes in reference to the activity. So we know we're bringing in clients through our admission process, but now we're going to quantify that. And we can look at anything. We might look at the average household income of enrolled clients. That might be an important output to us because it may impact their, success in the program. So we also have our service dosage example. So we might be looking at the average number of treatment classes attended by a client. We might look at the number and proportion of participants who are completing all of their treatment requirements. So we know that, our recovery court programs are lengthy. So it's still a success if we can show, hey, someone may not necessarily complete the entire program, but what about if they completed treatment? If they completed treatment classes, is there a point where, that information is important, or is there a point in time in our program or a phase structure where we see clients dropping off? They get to a certain point in the program or the treatment, and then they're absconding or something's happening. So we might be able to look at that information, to that dosage, to see where some of these things are happening. What's the number and proportion of, face-to-face contacts? that we're having that are actually completed. So if an appointment's set up with your case manager, does John Henry attend 100% of the time? Does he attend 50% of the time? So we can put a dosage to that interaction that we're having with our clients. When we're thinking about satisfaction, we can look at, if we have a survey tool, the number and proportion of participants that indicate that they were satisfied or very satisfied with some of our program services, or we can have them rank their satisfaction. So we have some different ways that we can numerically capture that information. So just to kind of simplify a little bit of some additional examples of what can be evaluated during a process eval, we might look at, do we have the proper staff hired and trained? Have we, do we have a process within our policies and procedures to regularly monitor our program performance? Do we have sufficient space or equipment to actually operate our program? Is there an adequate program mission, policy, procedure, regulation? Do we have a handbook? Does our handbook reflect the information that our client actually needs to see? Or that, if we did interviews, would they give us feedback to say, I wish I would have known X? And I can think of a really great example. I worked with a client who had information out there that their program was between 9 and 12 months. But when we looked at their actual data, it indicated that their program was more like 13 to 14 months and that no one had completed in that earlier time frame. And so what we did was we changed the marketing materials to reflect the actual number of months that it was taking people to complete, because that miscommunication of information was ultimately affecting individuals because they were being presented an idea that wasn't a timeline, that wasn't actually realistic. And people knew that. They were talking about it in the jail, former participants were talking about it, and it was actually a barrier to engagement in services for those who went into the program. So once that marketing material changed and the true number went out there, they saw a lot less frustration out of new clients because they were open and honest about the time frame that it was actually taking to complete the program. We can look at our available information systems and collecting that relevant program data in place. So many of you are using 10WITS, and that is, the information system and data collection, vehicle that we have available to us, and it has a lot of different capabilities. However, you might be collecting information in a spreadsheet, an Access database. You might have just your physical paper copies that you might look at digitizing, but we want to review, do we have all the information we need? And if we have the information, is it in a way that we can accurately use it and report on it? Can we get to it timely? And is it comprehensive? If we have all these questions, not only do we have it, but can we access it in a time frame that's meaningful? We also want to have clear and concise informational materials. And I just kind of touched on that, but it's so important that if you have expectations, if there are things that are important to know about your program, that they're very clear on the front end, and that those individuals, those potential participants, see them, and that it matches and aligns with the other things you're going to give them later. So is our language actually consistent between a brochure, a one-pager? Is it then consistent between the handbook that they're going to sign off on? So we want to make sure that what we're representing as far as expectations is consistent throughout all of our materials as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some other types of evaluation. So we said that essentially a process evaluation, doesn't have to stand alone. And there are so many types of evaluations, but the one that you probably are most familiar with is an outcome evaluation. And that's typically used when a program has, when you have some outcomes to look at. And so we want, how have we achieved those outcomes? We're looking at, not so much the processes, but are we looking to reduce recidivism? We need time to determine whether those outcomes have been met. Are we increasing our program completion rates? So it's less about the process of how we got there and more about the outcomes that we want to see for the individuals that we're serving. We want, to understand through an outcome evaluation, basically the degree that the program is having an effect on the population's behaviors. So what's been changed as a result of being here in the program. And then, it's going to tell us whether or not we're being effective at meeting those objectives that we have for our program. With our impact evaluation, this is a type of outcome evaluation, and it's typically used, during a program's existence at an appropriate interval or at the end of a project. So we're looking at, the degree that your program or your project met its overall, its ultimate goal. So whatever that was, if, you have a federal award and you have specific goals and objectives, what is the impact of that program at the end of the time frame? And it provides us an opportunity to have some policy information to impact either policy or funding decisions. We have different kinds of economic evaluation, cost benefit, cost effective analyses. Typically they're done at the beginning of a program or during the operation of a program. And it's really taking a closer look at what resources are being used in the program, their costs, direct and indirect, and we're going to compare that to our outcomes. So it provides the program coordinator and funders a way to assess cost relative to effect. So how much bang are we getting for the buck that we're putting in? So I wanted to kind of put this figure up, and I recognize I probably should have put it in the presentation twice, but when we're looking at kind of the relationship between a process and an outcome evaluation, or any other kind of evaluation for that matter, our process evaluation is really happening across these initial items. It's, what are those activities, that dosage, the characteristics of our clients, all of those activities we talked about, those are happening here. And we're evaluating the activities and how those turn into those quantifiable outputs, the number that were enrolled in the program, the number of treatment services attended. So a process is looking at those, again, inputs, activities that the program does, and then the outputs that it's generating. Our outcome evaluation and other kinds of impact evaluation, they're happening more along after time has passed. So we can see that there is going to be some short-term outcomes that, maybe we're looking at, and, our long-term outcomes, which are ultimately, have we improved the overall health of the individuals are we seeing long-term health improvements of the individuals we're serving? Are we seeing decreases in recidivism? Are we, what are those long-term outcomes versus something that's, happening very early on in the program? So that's just a visual to help you realize that we've been kind of working today within this part of an evaluation, and then looking at the longer term effects is happening later on in that process. So I'm going to pause for another question break because that's a lot of info. And Marie, I don't have it's 12:30. I'm going to keep on trucking.
Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can stick them in the chat box, or you can just unmute and ask her.
I hope everyone's still feeling hopeful, but we're going to keep pressing on. So evaluators, what are we looking for? Because I've touched on the fact if you have a third-party objective evaluator, or if you're doing, your own self-assessment, it's still important to know what to look for. So we want to have someone who has experience as an evaluator. There is no degree that you can get that, or designation that you can get that says, hey, you're an evaluator. It's, so you want to make sure that when you're looking for someone, that they've managed, design, and carried out an actual evaluation from start to finish. We want to ensure that they have strong research skills and that they can communicate with you and, between you and whether it's your funding source, whether it's stakeholders that you have to report back to. I know we've had clients who have asked us to speak to their board. So how do we translate all the data analysis and talk and speak, to the client in a way that makes sense and communicate this information so that they can then communicate that? Because at some point, you may, the relationship with the evaluator may end, and you want to have, be empowered to communicate your own results without that person all the time. So having that trust and that communication is really important. And then you want to look for someone who understands the recovery court context. And if you don't have that, at least having someone who has experience working, with criminal justice, work, topic areas, you're not going to necessarily find the one person who can do it all, but you want them to have an understanding of your context, because that's, that's how you're going to be able to get the information that you need out of the evaluation that you have. So one of my favorite groups is Evaluate out of Michigan, and they have this really great diagram about who can do evaluation. And the way they kind of set this up is an external evaluator can come in and help develop and select data instruments and tools. They can help support data analysis, although I have found that some programs have people on their teams that are capable of doing some data analysis. They come in and help write reports and facilitate the use of those results. Our project or our program teams, they're the maintainer of the record. They are capturing all of the activities, all of the services, all of the things that are happening for the participants and partners, and they're documenting those regularly and documenting those accomplishments. But where these two groups merge is in the planning that we talked about today, and also in the collection of data. So while the evaluator might be bringing in some new methodologies or tools to collect data, you're already a collector of data. You're entering that information into the system. You are cataloging information daily on what it is that's happening with your participants. And so that, needs to be recognized. And you both are there to interpret results. Like I said, it's so important to have that discussion, that rapport, and that trust with whoever you're working with to say, hey, these things happened. They may not be part of the policies, but it's the context. It may be a contributing factor to why we are seeing some of the things we're seeing. And being able to have those conversations so that as you develop those final products, that you have, a robust review of what it is that actually is happening and has happened to that program. So when we're thinking about an evaluator, you might be thinking, well, what services or what do I actually need? So these are, this is a handout that I have for people who are looking to engage with Allard Consulting, but we have a variety of services. So you really need to think with your team and plan out, what is it that we're looking to accomplish? And I'll just use my own stuff as an example, but are you looking for someone to help you with future funding? Do you need some grant coaching? Is that how to develop a competitive project evaluation and design section so that you can receive additional funds to sustain programming? Do you need someone to come in and do what we've talked about today, just something mini, like a process evaluation, looking at process flow, identifying gaps and challenges, helping you build a logic model, and discussing, the need or the development of some new marketing materials? We've had a lot of people come to us and ask, for some different or updated materials because, what you'll see in the August session, the graphic designer I collaborate with, Sherry Self, has come in on a lot of projects and built these beautiful brochures, posters that are hanging up in programs, and, how we can take the information about your program and the evaluation piece and translate that in a way that is eye-catching and informative is really important. And, you know, a lot of times we only had resources available to us, like Word, to create a brochure, and we want to update and change and be fresh and new. So it's a way to engage an evaluator that might do some of that as well. And then, you know, we also provide some like more robust evaluation services. So we do grants management, we do all of the reporting and data review for, you know, federal awards. So depending on what you need, you want to have that open discussion with the person that you're going to contract with, so that, you know, there's a clear expectation on the scope of what it is they're providing you up front, because ultimately that's going to feed into, I'm sure you're thinking, well, no, it's the next slide, but, you know, that conversation allows you to develop a scope, because that scope is going to be, you know, what it is that that evaluator adheres to throughout the time that they're working with you. So if it's just a process evaluation, you might want to say that, you know, you're looking, they might come back and say, we're going to do a document review, we're going to develop that logic model, we're going to do some systems mapping. So what resources do you have? What resources have you not tapped into in your community? Do that existing data review, and then some, you know, reporting, presentation, and visual at the end of that time frame. So you want to be able to come back and have a scope of what they're going to provide you with some detail. You know, what can you expect as a result of either spending money or bringing in a volunteer, you know, and what's their time giving you? So our rule of thumb in the evaluation world is 10% of a project budget should be dedicated for evaluation costs. If you're looking at federal funding, it will vary by the funder. That can range anywhere from 10% to 20% of a project award. But you want to, if you can, be able to, you know, budget for this kind of work, whether that's a process evaluation or an outcome evaluation, or even just some other of those services that we briefly discussed. So just something to consider. When we're looking at cost, you know, it's hard to frame sometimes, but I wanted to provide some kind of visual that, you know, on when we're looking at process questions, you know, that tends to be process and implementation tends to be less costly than questions around longer term outcomes, because of the time and data needed and associated with, you know, actually answering those kinds of questions. Just having data can affect your budget as well. So many of you already have existing data to work from, but do we need new data to answer the evaluation questions you've come up with? And that can be more expensive. For our process evaluations, you know, quantitative data is not as time consuming because it's already there, but qualitative data tends to be more time consuming because we have to clean, analyze, and it just may be more expensive in the long run. We also want to, you know, recognize that the level of involvement of an evaluator might vary dependent on whether you need them more or less, and how much your budget is. You know, it may result in you know, their time and what that scope of project looks like. We also have, as I mentioned, if you are, you know, using more internal skill sets to your team, existing team, then that's again a less costly way of, you know, incorporating evaluation. When you have to look for someone who is external, sometimes that can be pricier. And then with COVID, we haven't had as much travel, but it's still worthwhile to recognize that, you know, travel is typically part of that budget. How far away is the person you're working with? I know I live in Alabama and I drive from Memphis to Johnson City regularly, but, you know, how do you account for the time that someone needs to come and physically be with you to help you achieve the goals and objectives? How, you know, and that's going to also impact that budget. So this is more like, it's not saying how you should develop a budget by any stretch. It's just some things to consider when you're looking at, you know, building in a budget for evaluation, and some things to consider. but having a conversation on the front end with your evaluator, is just going to help you identify that available budget. So what is it that you want to accomplish, and having an open conversation to help make sure that you're getting to a place that you're both comfortable. So what if a recovery court cannot find or use an external evaluator? Well, sometimes it's not feasible, but it really shouldn't be seen as an impediment to improvement, because again, I'm going to go back to best practices and standards and our 10 key components. It's something you've indicated as a recovery court that you're already or just now initiating if you're a new court. And so, we want to find ways to self-assess as much as we can. And really if we are doing that, we want to take a step back and make sure that, if I'm the coordinator and I'm internally looking at the program I work and live and breathe every single day, that I'm able to step back as part of that self-assessment with my team and really take a bird's eye view. We don't want to overlook a challenge or a barrier or a need of our program because we're too close to it sometimes, but there are ways to self-assess and still get the results from that process evaluation that you would need. So ultimately, how important is a process evaluation? I'm a firm believer everyone has the opportunity and ability to improve their internal processes and service delivery. But it's a management decision ultimately to prioritize a process or any kind of evaluation. And realistically, unless it's something that is mandatory, it's usually not at the top of any one organization's list to do because it goes back to there's so much happening in the day-to-day. So again, if the resources allow, hire that experienced professional evaluator to come in and look at the program and then find ways to, hear and implement the recommendations if it's possible. Again, self-assessment is not a negative. It's just making sure that we've done all of that planning. All of the things we've talked about today still apply. We need to ask those questions. We need to identify our data. We want to go back and interpret the results as a team and then come up with some kind of product that allows us to use and actually build off of that information we've spent time gathering. And then if you need anything, you can always call. I believe I tell everyone I work with, you can find me email, phone, carrier pigeon, because I don't ever turn it off. And, we're here to help you. We want you to be successful. It's just how I like to do business. Like if you have a need, let's talk about it and see if there's a way to help. So I think I put question break, but actually that is the end of my presentation. So are there any questions? Is there anything just burning inside about process evaluation or evaluators that you want to know?
Well, I recognize it is a quarter till, so if you need to step out, please do that. But I know one of the takeaways that seems really obvious from your presentation to me is that if you are struggling with the cost, like you don't have a big budget, one of the ways you can try to help the evaluation budget is to do as much of the planning and review of your documents and data that you collect and or need to collect before you begin to engage as much as you can with the capacity that you have, right? I know everybody doesn't necessarily have the capacity to think through all of those things because there's a lot to look at, but to the extent that you can do all that planning, it's gonna cut down on how much the evaluator has to do that for you or with you, right?
Yes, definitely, Marie. And I realized I am that person who put their own email in wrong. So it's allardconsultingllc.com, but I apologize. It won't let me fix it.
I was about to say, it's cause nulting.
I know.
Oh, that's great. Anybody else? I'm seeing stuff in the very interesting training, lots of information, very informative presentation. Jane says, thank you. You broke this down so my brain could handle it today.
Yay. And, it is hard to consolidate evaluation and logic models and all of the things that we've touched on today into an hour. I mean, I've taken semesters of classes on how to do some of these things. So I understand that it is a lot of information, but, ultimately you have the ability to do a lot of this. It's just taking the time to, like Marie said, plan for her and determine what it is you actually need answers to.
And the idea of a part 3 logic models is not a bad idea. Logic models not only can help with the evaluation concept and processes, but with any grant writing too, because you can write grants as, as your logic model oftentimes, because it's so logical. It has all the components that most grantors request of you. All right, well, I don't see nobody is unmuting, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So I think that we are good there. Lauren, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to turn my thing. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing that and being flexible about your time. I am so sorry about that. Lauren is doing part 2, where she's talking about the more marketing piece and visualization, and that is August 11th. From 11 to 12:15. I did change that. So, and registration is up, so you can register for that. If you do have questions past right now, her information is on the slide. And also you can email me if you are trying to get in touch with her. So thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time, okay?
Thank you.
I know you have to scoot out of here, Lauren. So I appreciate it. I'm going to just hang out in case anybody has any training related questions, I guess.
No worries.
Kate says thank you. So you're traveling, right, Lauren? So be safe, okay?
I will. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll talk soon.